This is lecture 19 for Biology 177. We are going to move into musculature part 2 with the appendicular musculature. Now, just to kind of remind you, the appendicular muscles are for the limbs. So the appendicular muscles themselves will stabilize, position, and support the limbs. And they are categorized, of course, into the upper and lower limbs. The upper limbs are divided into the pectoral girdle, and then muscles that move the arm, and then we're going to talk about the forearm as well. Muscles that position the pectoral girdle originate on the axial skeleton, so on the sternum, clavicle, ribs, etc., and they insert on the clavicle and scapula. Muscles that move the arm are going to originate on the pectoral girdle and thoracic cage, and then they insert down on the humerus. Moving down the upper limb, we're going to talk about muscles that move the forearm and hand. Here, these are going to actually originate on the pectoral girdle and on the arm, and then work their way down to the radius, ulna, and carpals. And then there are the extrinsic muscles of the hands and fingers. These are going to originate on the humerus, radius, and ulna, and then insert directly onto the metacarpals of the palm and to the phalanges or fingers. The intrinsic muscles of the hand, which we're not really going to cover in this class, you're welcome to look at them in the visible body lab, but we won't really be testing on them. These muscles are going to perform very fine movements and primarily originate on the carpals or metacarpals. They're very small muscles that are involved in the movement of the hands. Now, this is simply an overview of the axial and appendicular muscles put together. We're going to focus primarily on the appendicular muscles here and how they actually come off of the axial skeleton. So we can notice on the superficial dissection side, we can see the platysma, the deltoid, the pecs as they extend down. And then deeper to this are a number of other deeper stabilizing muscles that we're going to cover in depth. This is a posterior view of the same picture we just looked at in the last slide. Again, let's take a look at the superficial dissection. We can see the appendicular muscles of the trapezius, deltoid, some of the other more exposed muscles of the rotator cuff as it extends down to the latissimus dorsi. On the deep dissection side, we've removed the trapezius, and now underneath the trapezius, we can see the rhomboid muscles. We can see levator scapulae, and we can see the supraspinatus, which is part of the rotator cuff. We also have more exposure to see the erector spinae group that we talked about in the previous lecture series. Now we're going to look in depth a little bit more at some of the individual muscles of the pectoral girdle. Remember that these are going to be slightly smaller muscles that are designed to help increase upper limb mobility. Now there are the muscles of the chest, like the pectoralis minor and serratus anterior, and the muscles of the back, like the trapezius and the levator scapulae. Here we can see a few muscles that actually position the pectoral girdle. First is the trapezius. The trapezius is going to originate at the occipital bone and then C7 through T12. So it has those two origin sites. It's going to insert on the acromion of the scapula, the spine of the scapula, and then on the clavicle. This means it's going to have quite a few different actions. It primarily is going to extend the neck and elevate the scapula. Some of the other ones are going to be the levator scapula. The levator scapula is involved in the actual pulling the scapula forward. It's going to originate at C1 through C4, and it inserts directly on the scapula, moving it. We also see the subclavius and the pectoralis minor. The pectoralis minor originates on ribs 3 through 5 and inserts on the coracoid process. Now, this is a stabilizer for the pectoral girdle and helps to stabilize the scapula inferiorly. Finally, we have the serratus anterior, which is going to originate on ribs 1 through 8, insert on the scapula, and it's going to serve a similar function to the actual levator scapula in pulling the scapula forward. And this is entirely designed to help to stabilize the scapula during upward movement or trying to press weight overhead. So, just kind of reiterating, the trapezius is the largest muscle in this group, and it's commonly referred to as the traps. An exercise that would train this muscle specifically would be something like weighted shrugs. Specific regions can contract independently, so it results in highly varied actions. It does more actions than what I've listed on your OIA sheet as well. Here we can see a great view of the trapezius muscle, again taking note of its multiple origin sites from the occipital bone all the way down the vertebral column and its insertion onto the actual scapula. So you can kind of see the direction that it's going to be pulling those muscle groups. Then on the other side here, we can also see a better view of the levator scapula, and we can see, oh, that's going to pull the scapula up and forward. I also want to take this opportunity to take note of the rhomboid muscles. Rhomboidus major and minor. Now major is below minor, but it's referred to as major because it is larger in size. These are going to originate at C7 through T5, and they insert on the scapula. And you can see that there. It originates on the vertebral column, and it's going to insert on the scapula, specifically on the medial border. Now, what does the rhomboid do? It is going to adduct and medially rotate the scapula. Adduction, remember, is bringing things closer into the midline. So an example of what this would do is pinch your shoulder blades together. That's the action of adduction of the scapula. An exercise that would train this would be things like seated rows, where you actually are going to row the weight or cable into your chest and pinch your shoulder blades together. So it's going to train your upper back. Other things that would help to train like the trapezius and the rhomboids would be things like face pulls with either a pulley or a band. They would also get some training from a lat pull down, but that's going to be more latissimus dorsi focused. You can also see a great view of the serratus anterior and actually where it comes down from ribs 1 through 8 and is going to insert onto the scapula and help to pull the scapula forward, specifically during overhead movements. Now we're going to move on to muscles that move the arm. So this is moving down from the pectoral girdle and looking at some of the muscles of the upper arm that extend down to the elbow. These are going to originate on the clavicle, scapula, and thoracic cage. The latissimus dorsi and deltoid are the largest superficial muscles associated with arm movement. Many small muscles are going to originate on the scapula. Let's take a look at some of these. So here we can see some of the muscles that actually move the arm, with the first major muscle being part of the pectoral girdle, but it is actually going to be very much involved in moving the arm, and that's the pectoralis major. This is going to originate on the clavicle, sternum, and ribs 3 through 5. It inserts on the proximal humerus, and its action is going to be adduction, so bringing that arm closer to the point of midline, and flexion of the arm. This is why exercises that are more commonly associated with this muscle are going to be push-ups, bench press, dumbbell bench press, and flies. The deltoid is going to sit on the lateral aspect of the shoulder and is going to originate on the clavicle, acromion, and scapular spine. It inserts on the deltoid tuberosity, and its action is going to be abduction and rotation of the arm. So any sort of shoulder exercise is going to work the deltoids. Think lateral raises, front raises, overhead press. Maybe why it's called shoulder press, because it trains the shoulders, or deltoids in this case. Some other muscles that are listed here that move the arm as well are going to be the subscapularis, which is actually going to be part of the rotator cuff, and that's going to originate on the subscapular fossa and insert on the lesser tubercle of the humerus. It is involved in internal rotation of the humerus. So if you take your arm in anatomical position where the thumb is pointing laterally and then you turn it inwards to point towards the body, that is going to be internal rotation of the humerus, making sure that the arm, the upper arm, is going to rotate in. The other muscles that we can see there are going to, of course, be the coracobrachialis, and the coracobrachialis is going to originate on the coracoid process and insert on the medial humerus. It is involved in adduction and flexion of the arm, so it's going to work in conjunction with pectoralis major. Finally, we have the teres major there. Now, teres major is going to be larger than the teres minor, and this is going to originate on the scapula and insert at the proximal humerus, and it is involved in adduction and internal rotation of the arm. So it's going to help in conjunction with subscapularis. Here we can see a posterior view of many of the muscles that move the arm. I actually want to start towards the bottom, specifically looking at latissimus dorsi on muscles that move the arm. So we can see it's supraspinatus, deltoid, and latissimus dorsi. The latissimus dorsi is a large muscle. It originates on the T7 through T12 and on the iliac crest. So it's going to be lower down on your back, but it's going to insert at the proximal humerus. So it's going to wrap up and around and come underneath to insert at the humerus, and it performs adduction and extension of the humerus. So think of lat pull down, pull ups, or any sort of push back. If you keep your arm straight and then push your hand back towards the body, extending your arm, that will be engaging your latissimus dorsi and performing extension of the humerus. Other muscles, we of course have covered the deltoid. The supraspinatus is actually one of 4 muscles that is part of the rotator cuff. Supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. Now we already covered subscapularis, so let's start with supraspinatus here. Supraspinatus originates at the supraspinous fossa and inserts at the greater tubercle. The infraspinatus is going to originate at the infraspinous fossa, and the teres minor is going to originate at the lateral scapula. The supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor all insert at that greater tubercle. So that's going to be a little bit easier when learning it. Supraspinatus is going to perform abduction of the humerus. So think of a lateral raise. Infraspinatus is going to perform external rotation of the humerus. So if I raise my arm up and out and then bend my elbow to where my hand is pointed straight up at the sky, if I try to push my hand backwards, that would be external rotation. The infraspinatus and teres minor are both going to help during external rotation. So those muscles, like I said, are the rotator cuff. The rotator cuff is the common name for the collection of these 4 muscles and associated tendons that are involved in the movement of the arm. They're really important in throwing a ball. So very important, especially for baseball pitchers. Those guys know every single one of their rotator cuff muscles and make it a part of their training to keep those muscles healthy. It's often injured in that case in a lot of those sports like football or baseball. And so it's why it's so heavily studied. The acronym for learning them is called SITS. This helps you remember them. And it goes from the most superior going on the posterior aspect around and down. So it goes supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. Here we can actually see a lateral view of these different muscles partially dissected in their relationship to each other in conjunction with the glenoid cavity. We're now going to move down the arm to muscles that move the forearm and hand. These are going to originate on the scapula, humerus, radius, or ulna, and the wrist extensors are best seen on the posterior surface. So if we have our hands in anatomical position, you can actually feel all of your extensors on the lateral aspect of your elbow. That's where they all are. So if you extend your fingers, you'll feel those muscles on the posterior aspect of your forearm, posterior lateral, are going to actually contract. Now, if you flex your fingers, if you clench a fist and then flex your wrist, you'll feel the medial aspect of your forearm, medial anterior aspect of your forearm actually contract. These are your wrist flexors on the anterior medial surface. Now I want to introduce you to the most important muscles in the entire body, and these are the elbow flexors. Here you can see biceps brachii, the brachialis, and the brachioradialis. They are going to help make sure that your arms look a little bit bigger. Now, that is my first imitation for this class. We'll see if they get any better. That was our former governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger. The biceps brachii that you can see here originates on the coracoid process and glenoid, the glenoid cavity, and is actually going to insert on the radial tuberosity of the radius. And this means it is going to perform flexion of the elbow, and it's also going to flex and bring the shoulder forward. The brachialis performs this same action, and it sits deep to the biceps brachii, and it's actually a huge prime mover in conjunction with the biceps brachii. Brachialis actually produces more total force during a curl or elbow flexion than biceps brachii does. Brachialis is going to originate on the distal humerus and insert on the coronoid process of the ulna. So a combination of the brachialis and the biceps brachii are going to pull both forearm muscles up. The brachioradialis is designed to flex the elbow as well and primarily acts as a lateral stabilizer. It originates at the distal humerus and inserts at the radial styloid process. Working our way down, let's take a look at a few of the wrist flexors. So here we can see some of the wrist flexors listed, like flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor carpi ulnaris. These are all going to originate on the medial epicondyle of the humerus. They insert at different points. So flexor carpi radialis is actually going to insert at the metacarpals. Flexor carpi ulnaris is going to insert at the carpals themselves, and palmaris longus is going to insert at the flexor retinaculum that we can see down at the bottom. It's where the wrist is. We'll talk about that in a moment. The other muscles that we can see here are going to be pronators and supinators. The pronators and supinators, pronator teres, supinator, and then pronator quadratus, are going to perform those respective actions. So we can actually, the pronator is going to pronate, and as far as turning the thumb inwards when in anatomical position, the supinator is going to perform the opposite action. This is a posterior view of the arm showing you the backside. So that way, this is where you build a little bit more size to the arm, training the elbow extensors like the triceps brachii. Now, triceps brachii is going to originate at the scapula and shaft of the humerus and insert on the olecranon process. Its action is, of course, to extend the elbow. So exercises for this would be like tricep extensions, skull crushers, overhead press or shoulder press, and any sort of pec exercise typically involves the triceps as well. Then, working our way down from the elbow, we have the wrist extensors. Extensor carpi ulnaris, carpi radialis longus, and carpi radialis brevis. Now, they're all extensors, so this means it's going to be really easy to remember their origin site. The origin site for all of them is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Notice that. We've talked about the flexors. They originate at the medial epicondyle. Extensors are going to originate at the lateral epicondyle. Extensor digitorum is going to insert at the phalanges, carpi radialis longus, metacarpal 2, and carpi ulnaris, metacarpal 5. They are all involved in extension, either of the fingers, wrist, or all of the above. Now, some other connective tissue is going to be the retinaculum. The retinaculum, it has both the flexor, which is going to be on an anatomical position, the anterior surface. The extensor retinaculum is going to be on the posterior surface. And the retinaculum itself is a band of connective tissue that is going to hold the tendons that work their way to the fingers in place. So it wraps around the entire wrist, and it's going to hold those tendons in place. Within the wrist, we have an interesting structure of a synovial tendon sheath. This is a tubular bursa that surrounds the tendon where it crosses the bony surface. So like tendons of the flexor muscles as they pass through the tendon sheaths deep to the flexor retinaculum. Now, with prolonged usage, we can get inflammation of this area, inflammation of this tendon sheath, and this causes carpal tunnel syndrome. Now, carpal tunnel syndrome is inflammation of the tendon sheath that restricts tendon movement and puts pressure on the median nerve. This causes tingling, muscle weakness, and chronic pain of the wrist and hand. It's particularly apparent in the lateral half of the hand, like the pollex and digits 2 through 3. There are no conclusive studies that prove carpal tunnel is caused by typing on a computer, using a mouse, or repetitive movements while working, but it seems to be associated with this in some capacity. Here we can actually see the median nerve as it works its way through the hand and into the fingers. And this is, of course, the area where it can become inflamed and block. I'll show you a little bit more in the next slide, but I want to use this slide as an opportunity to mention the hand grips. The human hand is capable of movements that no other animals possess. This is primarily due to the thumb, or pollex. And we are capable of two distinct grips. The first is a power grip. A power grip is where the fingers grasp an object and the thumb applies opposing pressure. Think rowing or gripping a hammer. So that way we can actually grip and stabilize an item in our actual hand. Precision grip is the other type, and this is a very unique one. It's the ability to touch the pads of the distal phalanges with the pad of the thumb. So this is performing the movement of opposition. Think gripping a pencil or pinching. Only primates actually have this ability, and all non-human primates are more restricted in this compared with humans. We have much more developed nervous system with respect to our hands and a greater degree of control with them. Here we can actually see another great view of the carpal region and the median nerve and how it runs through that wrist. So you can easily see how the inflammation can block that nerve and then numb the hand. Now we want to actually start moving to the lower part of the body and look at the pelvic girdle and lower limb. The pelvic girdle is going to support and protect the lower viscera and the developing fetus in females. And the bones of the pelvic girdle and lower limb are much more massive than their homologs of the upper limb. So when comparing the femur to the actual humerus, the femur is much larger. So here we can see some of the deep muscles that move the hip. Now, a lot of muscles of the upper thigh have actually been removed so that we can start with the muscles of the hip, specifically the iliopsoas complex, which is composed of the psoas major muscle, origin T12 through L5, and the iliacus, origin iliac fossa. Both of the muscles merge together and insert at the lesser trochanter, and their action is to flex hip and spine. They are actually going to be a major linking factor between the axial skeleton and the lower portion of the appendicular skeleton. Just a little bit deeper, we can actually see some of the adductor muscles, and I'll take time to go through some of those. So remember that adductors are actually going to bring things closer in to the body, so bringing the femurs closer together. Here we can see adductor brevis, longus, magnus, and of course gracilis. Adductor magnus is going to originate at ischium and pubis. The adductor longus is going to originate at the pubis, and the gracilis is going to originate at the pubis and ischium. We can also see on the left leg here is the pectineus as well. The pectineus is another adductor that is going to originate on the pubis. Pectineus, adductor longus, magnus, and even brevis are going to originate at different points, but they all insert at the linea aspera. Gracilis actually goes a little bit further down and is going to insert at the medial tibia. All of these muscles are adductors, meaning their action is to adduct the thigh. One of the last muscles I want to talk about on this slide is the sartorius. I'll point it out again when we actually have all the muscles of the thigh apparent, but the sartorius is going to originate at the anterior superior iliac spine and insert at the tibia. Its action is to abduct and externally rotate the thigh. Here we can actually see a fully muscled thigh on an anterior view. Take note of the sartorius again now that the thigh muscles are in place. We can see how it wraps itself around. Some of these muscles here, these are all quadricep muscles, and so these muscles are knee extensors. The quad muscles are going to be composed of the vastus lateralis, medialis, and intermedius. Intermedius you can't see here because it is deep to the rectus femoris. Now, the vastus muscles are all going to originate at the linea aspera. They insert at the patella. The rectus femoris is actually going to originate a little bit higher at the anterior inferior iliac spine. Take note of that, being that these muscles, the vastus muscles, are all going to originate on the femur, whereas the rectus femoris is going to originate up on the hip and the iliac bone, specifically the anterior inferior iliac spine. They all insert at the patella, so one of their primary actions is going to be to extend the knee. But the rectus femoris is also going to flex the hip. It is the initiator of hip flexion that is followed up and assisted by the iliopsoas muscles. Some other muscles to note here is we can see the gluteus medius and then some of the adductors. I'll talk about the gluteus medius a little bit more in a bit. Flipping over to the side, we can see the gluteus maximus muscles and then the gluteus medius muscle. The gluteus maximus is actually going to be one of the major extensors of the hip, primarily during exercises like sprinting. So this could also be trained, of course, during like glute kickbacks or hip bridges and things like that. So it extends the hip. The gluteus medius is going to be involved in extending the hip as well, but also in abduction. The gluteus maximus is going to originate at the ilium, sacrum, and coccyx, and insert at the femur and then into the IT band. The gluteus medius is going to originate at the ilium and insert at the greater trochanter. It is going to extend and rotate the hip medially as opposed to laterally like the gluteus maximus does. Now, we can see the top muscle there. I want you to take note of the iliotibial tract. The iliotibial tract is a long tendinous sheath that acts as an extension of the TFL, or tensor fasciae latae. The tensor fasciae latae is going to sit up at the iliac crest where it originates, and it inserts via the IT band all the way to the lateral aspect of the tibia. And this is going to actually perform abduction of the thigh. It's a huge stabilizer during running or walking as well, and you can feel the IT band engage during that time. Really wish we had a cadaver so you could see how thick the IT band tendon actually is. It's really impressive. Looking here, we can also see on this view, on the right side of the picture, we see a lot of the hamstring muscles. I'm going to cover those in another slide. This slide is actually a great view of the hamstring muscles. We can see the posterior aspect of the leg with the gluteus maximus as it extends down to the different hamstring muscles. Now, the hamstring muscles are all knee flexors. So we have biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus. The tendinosus actually sits superficial to the membranosus directly on top. All three of these muscles are going to originate on the ischium, and they all insert at the tibia, but the biceps femoris has, because it has two heads, is going to insert at the tibia and the fibula. They all perform the same action: extend hip and flex knee. So they are hip extensors as well as knee flexors. The last muscle to talk about is a little bit deeper, the popliteus, that we can't see here in this slide, but it's going to originate on the lateral femoral condyle and insert on the tibia. It performs internal rotation as well as flexion of the knee. Here's a closer view so we can see that gluteus maximus as it wraps over, and we can see where the adductor muscles come in at the side just next to the hamstring muscles. Notice that the biceps femoris muscle is going to be the most lateral of the actual muscles. So the order from lateral to medial would be biceps femoris, then the semitendinosus muscle sits on top of the membranosus as it wraps back around to the adductors. This is a deep view of many of the gluteal muscles. So you can see where we've severed away the gluteus maximus, and we can see the piriformis. We can see the gluteus medius, and we can see the gluteus minimus. I don't ask you to know the OIAs for these, but I simply want to show you the depth and breadth of all of the gluteal muscles and how they are designed to stabilize the hip. Here a little bit deeper down, we can actually see the hamstring muscles where they are going to meet up with the actual tibia and then down to the gastrocnemius. So extensors of the knee we've already talked about. That would be the vastus intermedius, which is going to be deep to the actual rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, which is going to be on the more lateral aspect of the femur, the vastus medialis, which is going to be on the medial aspect of the femur, and then of course rectus femoris. The three vastus muscles in the rectus femoris are going to make up the quadricep group. On the back side, we of course have those hamstring muscles. So you have biceps femoris, semimembranosus, semitendinosus. These are all going to be flexors of the knee, and these will be the hamstring groups. Sartorius is going to be a unique muscle that we include as a flexor of the knee because it allows for the crossing of the lower leg, where you can bring one leg over on top of the other and cross your legs. The popliteus is part of the flexors of the knee, but not considered exclusively part of the hamstring group. So moving down to the lower leg, we get to talk about some of the muscles that move the foot and toes, and these are going to be a lot of your shin muscles. We have, of course, the tibialis anterior, gastrocnemius, your peroneus or peroneals, and also called the fibularis longus, the soleus, and extensor digitorum longus. So here we can actually see some of those. Take note of the tibialis anterior. This one you can actually feel if you find where your shin bone directly is on the anterior aspect and just go a little bit lateral. That first muscle is actually your tibialis anterior. It originates on the tibia and inserts on the medial cuneiform, and what it does, dorsiflexion. So that's pulling your toes up towards your shin. Just next to the tibialis anterior is actually going to be, and slightly deep, is going to be extensor digitorum longus. Extensor digitorum longus is going to extend your toes and dorsiflex the foot. And it originates on the tibia and fibula and inserts at the middle and distal phalanges. Just next to that is going to be your peroneals, otherwise known as the fibularis longus. This is going to originate on the fibula, insert at the medial cuneiform, and it performs plantar flexion of the foot. It also acts as a major stabilizer of the lower leg during running as well. Here's a great posterior view. So that way we can take first look at the gastrocnemius, very powerful lower leg muscle that is going to originate on the femoral condyles and then insert at the heel bone or the calcaneus. This performs plantar flexion. Much like the muscle that we can see on the next picture where gastrocnemius is removed, here we can actually see the soleus. The soleus originates on the tibia and fibula and also inserts at the calcaneus. Both gastrocnemius and soleus are going to insert at the same spot via the calcaneal tendon, commonly known as the Achilles tendon, and they both perform plantar flexion. Take note, just above the soleus, you can actually see a great view of the popliteus muscle and where it actually originates and inserts. In the final slide of this lecture, I just want to showcase a lateral aspect of the leg so that way you can see an even better view of tibialis anterior, where extensor digitorum longus is, and then where the fibularis muscles are. So you can see that kind of natural progression of one muscle to the other and note their order. Tibialis anterior, extensor digitorum longus, fibularis longus, and then it moves back to the soleus and gastrocnemius. I lied. That wasn't the last slide. There is a little bit more. There's actually quite a bit more muscles. As I've stated before, there are 700 total muscles roughly in the body. I'm not requiring that you know all of them. The muscles that you do need to focus on a little bit more for the purposes of the lecture are going to be those that are on the OIA sheet that is provided on Cougar courses. There's origin, insertion, and action for every single muscle that is listed there. Most of them are going to be a little bit more superficial and some of the muscles that we more commonly know. There are, of course, going to be a number of dissections and 3D diagrams that are available to you on the Visible Body website. I strongly encourage that you go through those. I've given you more than you need to actually pass the quizzes, so that way you have the resource moving forward to kind of dissect the body and see how all of these muscles work. There's also some really great muscle action diagrams that they have on Visible Body. So following this lecture, definitely go and spend a little bit more time on Visible Body, spend time on the OIA sheet, and really learn the muscles moving forward.